In the Darkness I See by Anon Chapter 4 Meditations on Art. Many months droned on with an interestingly unpredictable steadiness as Tommy and I became rather familiar with one another. As time fluttered by, our mutual respect blossomed. For Tommy, the relationship had clearly moved from a cautious repeat inquisition into a routine-laden kinship. His intellect was finally being allowed to flower, and we knew it. He was infatuated by the satiation of his pleasurable ponderances, and I was enamored with the consistent challenge. Each session seemed to stand in juxtaposition to his scrambled, transient adolescence. During each of the iteration pieces of our perennial pattern puzzle, I peered upon the young man pleasantly as he reflected my own troubled youth. Through aiding in his trauma, I was reminded of my own darkness. I made sure never to initiate the bulk conversations with him, reinforcing his knowing of my voluntary role as no more than a listener and guide through his own solution-making process. The silence aided in my mindful musing and monitoring, Tommy often choosing to mourn for many minutes the noisiness of human expectancy. I scrupulously observed him, and soon noticed that, in every single session, he followed the same sequence of unprovoked actions. To start, after settling into each meeting, he would affix his gaze on my radiant window, staring into the fixture as if to transport his consciousness through the now makeshift portal. Once entranced within his tunneled vision, he would proceed to pick at his right thumb skin, which had been scrubbed almost completely clean of its unique patterning. After his untrainable Pavlovian sequence had been completed, he would follow by asking me a multitude of unanswerable questions and delving into a slew of unproductive fixations. Those tangential discourses became as commonplace as the beams of light piercing through his peering portal. The queries, bothersome and uncalculated, signified that my paternal scent had effectively wafted over his unconscious mind. I could tell that the relationship with the young man was entering the gray area where stern professionalism and tender compassion duelled. Upon each session's closing, just below his face, one clear and clumsy meta-question arose from the hole in his unwhole heart. "Why bother with all this?" I could read it asking. "Still so much is a heart stained with such inescapable grief and longing, and yet there is something to it. Yes, tomorrow?" Though incapable of asking directly, that was the question to which his traumatized soul couldn't seem to find the answer, even with all his pragmatic brilliance. I sensed that he understood that the therapy, as manipulated by him, was never truly going to rectify the problems, but rather heal the surface of his bloated psyche corpse. In his mind, he was not worthy of saving from his torment. After all, Tommy had said it best. "Intellectualism," whispered the boy after 1 or 2 minutes past time on the stranger day it was, "is the most direct denotation of sadness. The bright brain, when thinking too hard about one's self, is the beginning of the end." What he didn't realize was that I was frustrated for him. He was dueling with depression. But what he consistently chose to communicate to me, outside of disguised as invulnerable riddles, was his mega cluster of thoughts and generalizations about people and hierarchies. Though superbly apt, his unerring intellect acted as a buffer to protect the frayed fibers of his mortal soul from heavenly peace and stability. Most of his remarks were synonymous with professional consensus, but he couldn't remove himself from the derisive data. My poor boy was in true pain. I caught a glimpse of true happiness exuberantly leaping from Tommy's face on only one occasion. Tommy would often bring his cello to the meetings, but never had played it before I asked. He never told me why he brought that thing at all. After many catechizing probes, he finally agreed to play his wonderful instrument to me. It was a cold and glib afternoon, but warm and comfortable within my chambers, and so I knew that he couldn't resist the abstraction into cinematic creativity that was to be him warm masterfully playing his hum loveliness meltbox from within the withinness of the fireplace-like office of ours. After some additional coaxing contra his post-agreement reverse ambulation, he unpacked the behemoth, his sedulous demeanor growing as he rosined his bow. As if knowing precisely what the room needed, and without hesitation from him nor ingratiation from me, Tommy began to play the prelude to Bach's full cello suite No. 1. With each stroke, he pried life from the lumber. Tommy was the master of that moment, a gallant knight blazing his path on his marvelous timber steed. Each run of the bow gifted breath to the hollowed vessel, overwhelming vibrancy coursing through its powerful chest. The scene fell upon me with meteoric magnitude. The phenomenality of that dulcet tonality, crafted oh so tenderly by his crystalline virtuosity, engulfed me. Surrounded, with my senses overwhelmed, a steady stream of tears poured from my eyes, the vibration carrying through me as if I was some cellular matrix within a centrifuge, along for the ride, submerged in the glory of such a lovely moment. My heart was quickly filled with beauty and awe. Though my reaction was visceral, Tommy remained painstakingly entranced with his task, noticing me not. I was grateful for the more than accidental privacy, allowing me the freedom to be virtually, completely, persona-droppingly vulnerable. I suddenly found myself in 3 places at once. I was there in that room, enraptured by the music. I was in my past, reminiscing on my sorrows. And I was in Tommy's mind, aching for the dissolution of his torment. Not a microsecond was spared to relieve his pained tendons, arched back, or sweated brow. He had transcended humanity. His face was that of pure and tranquil focus. Each position on the fingerboard was held with intensity and accuracy. Each stroke of the bow was righteous and thorough. The dynamic dynamism of his chosen tempo, oh, that existential tempo, how indescribably great it was. The young man possessed the room. As the last note rang off, his whole body dropped down slightly, and his musculature relaxed. Melting away his grievous veneer, a joyous expression filled his face. The performance itself was not the cause of his facial restructuring, though. With great assiduity, in the silent piece, the posthumous placidness only offerable by a masterpiece played equi-masterfully, I viewed the fleeting seconds of that young man's most entirety. In his trance-fueled moment, he escaped it all for a blip of a blip. He held it, his end and truth totality's beginning. As he looked up from nowhere acknowledged, he registered my dampened face. He suddenly morphed his look of numb superbness into a smile that dragged him all the way back to earth. The change from clearly grand to covert glum plus some, like death's friend. It was as if a mustang had been released from its corral and allowed to bound through a meadow for a moment of prosperous glory, only to find the edge of its freedom. Its life of remaining reinstantiated as ceremoniously as always. With its terminal trail blazed once again, and finding itself hopeless and trapped once more, the broken bronco returned to redefine further its somber demeanor. With the duration and schedule of his emotional expressions much troubling me, it was instantly clear what his odd form meant to him. After we had both thought of ourselves, wondered about one another, and collected our emotions in a girthy internal aside, I asked for his definition of art. With little overt thoughtfulness, whilst returning his cello to its plastic concealment, Tommy quick-wittedly responded. "True art," he said, "is a slice of the moreness to being, acting as an eternal reminder of transcendent beauty and purity, Of course, this reminiscence is necessitated by the artist's sadness, anxiety, anger, and fear, oh awesome fear of life réel. Hell, maybe even joy or aesthetic appreciation leaks into true art. However, something tells me that Satie wasn't feeling joyful satisfaction when composing Gymnopédie No. 1, and I doubt auspicious love filled Hopper as he painted Nighthawks. I suppose it's the cursed gift of the artist's journey. The achievement and recognition of the art is an additional benefit for the true artist, not his main directive. And every man finds perhaps true virtue in accomplishments. An artist, on the other hand, finds revelation in expression. With that anti-rosy and clear truth stated, and its meaning finishing having its way with me, Tommy instantly corrected my confusion as to the timing and level of glee brought about by his cello playing. He hadn't played the piece to escape into some realm of paradise, like many artists do. Rather, he had created a ceremony, performing his own personal and rejoiceful remembrance. His work had become a part of history, that human mark, irrevocably read, struck into the earth, searing into the universal abyss, some powerful storm raging into the unknown darkness. Though he understood the importance of purposeful directionality and focused endeavoring, it troubled me that one of the only parts of his life that gave him enjoyment was impregnated with deeply negative ideations. Though the thoughts that he had composed were troubling, they reflected the reasoning of one of my father's loathed philosophers. Like Nietzsche, Tommy seemingly understood the visions of the two prototypical men, antithetical but equally forceful. After his cello performance, it became clear who he was. I elaborated on the theory that he had proposed, but took a more neutral stance on art. I added Tommy's own proclaimed nuance to Nietzsche's dichotomous men formulation and proposed the amalgamated form to him. I wished to understand if his derived notion of an artist was semi-stolen universal or accidentally concurrent with consensus individualized. There are two main avenues, I urgently sang out, for men to fruit their flowering power. Each man will unknowingly but vehemently choose a path. The first man, a grand and unartistic achiever, not endeavoring in the fortuitous flows of artistic formulations, will choose to allocate time only to the uncircuitous path of reality. The second man, the ambivalent artist, is shallow in the experiential expanse of his external life, but is well nourished in all the ontological and epistemological truths and estimations of the world, symbolized as they may be for said artist. A tangled and tattered natal nest is thus woven into the finest of fabrics. Both men fulfill their will to power. The first, in daily routine, finds his own micro-expressionism to be the simple engorging of his will. Abundant in clarity and unrepudiated in truth, the first man's life itself frets not with unknowns. The artist, with his excellence exiled to thoughtful loneliness like some prohibited paramour, with all his troubling qualms, devours the night, quiet contemplation compounding within him. He births the most frabjous fabrications of art that the world comes to know. Thus the second man's will-to-power process is effectuated. The second man's world is art. As I spoke my accidental recapitulation of his idea into being, I realized the similarity in our claims, and my amazement instantly grew. His conception was arguably more accurate than mine. After all, many of the post-religious artworks, with doctrinal propriety named piety liquefying, freedom more on the loose, and the West's phantasmic father unrealer by the daughter-driven day, echoing non-existence, had in fact been the result of strong and deep negative emotions and events. Those being manifestations of suffering remaining, but metaphysical solutions missing by way of proportionally post-arrogant church revolting. As I began to agree with greater deference, Tommy added, Perhaps it's the struggle of the artist to integrate the shadow self due to his overactive imagination, the impossibility of coexistence with his darkness, knowing the girth of evil lying beneath, and having imaginative depictions of his capacities drives the artist to create. Or go insane. I quickly agreed with his assertion in the shallow manner my haste allowed. Within the silent moment that followed, I indulged in his theorem and found no solidarity with a counterclaim. I then gave up my search and thanked God for my earlier complex vapid claims concurrence. His perspectives scrambling of my mind soon morphed into a stimulation of memory. I remembered my late grandmother. She had written for a painter's publication, interviewing all types of artists along the way. Though the tumultuous tapestry lives of her artists were bestowed upon them through different means, each artist pranced ponderously down each's promenade with a disorderly and entropic urgency. The role of the artist, as she saw it, was to reorder the chaos they had cultivated. She believed that each artist was gifted more than many with the unrelenting energy of the universe, unrefined and brimful, and made sense of the pandemonium through artistic expression. I shared her memory with Tommy, and he mournfully stared at me. I asked what was wrong. In his eyes, desperation lurked. The end of his musical performance had seemed to be an end of his joy. Similarly, my point lineage's pronouncement with specificity little seemed to make clear the unspecial nature of Tommy's suffering, making it all less worth it for him to endure the thing called Tommy. His stark difference and thought superiority, those lost frontiers, melting. I watched as the need between him and what should have been an existential knowing blossomed, and I instantly understood that we had reached our art talk's therapeutic limit. He needed more than depth arisen from self's suffocating on satisfaction express. All that potent grief was held within his low look. "The transience of joy befalls me again," screamed his face. Tommy's ungrateful, desired over-nexus between happiness and value immediately irritated me. I had already explained countless times before that he was fighting against himself. To reinstate my simple point, I took a moment to find a note I had written to an old client. He had also been an artist. His name was Donald Ruckus, and he had chased his impulses through every hedonic high and low imaginable. Eventually, he found his solace in a simple, sober life, accepting realities outside of his desires. The note, for Donald, became a symbol of life outside of himself. I hoped that Tommy would find the same security within it. I showed the note to Tommy. It read as follows. "The worth in life falls between moments of happiness. The structure one can create for themselves is the dopaminergic key to reverent fulfillment. Only goal-oriented paths are rich with fortune. Thus, one must systematically shape their lives in a fashion that allows for the continual creating, striving, and accomplishing of one's goals. Once this basic organization has taken place, a person may expunge their emptiness. Of course, moored to this rigid constitution are the moments of fleeting joy that are designated by the cyclicality of life. This is the best solution to life's stubbornly linear and frustratingly long reality, right? If one's biology only reacted in moments of impossible to be more than seconds at a time, momentary pure happiness or satisfaction, then most of life would be void of physical emotion. The whilst goal-achieving endocrinological stimulation system allows for each moment, if reaching into the unknown for something worthwhile, for something greater than one's current self, to be filled with purpose and fulfillment. What a gift, right? All there is to do to activate this satiation system, with one's purpose scalar to their level of consciousness, is to accept that it's not about you, and that life is work. Oh, but that pride, though. What to do about that pride? I smiled prematurely. Again with the wrong level of abstraction, cried Tommy, with an entirety of something all around him. Why? I scream. Stop telling me why it's better to live as if God exists. That stupid metaphysical good gamble from Pascal. Like the self-service of not only betting for, but the actual hope in the first place of eternal bliss for your little self isn't the most transparent thing in the world. Rather than all this lowering of so-called Lord into a timeshare explanation that basically lays out the operations of anyone with a complex enough mind to say, I don't know, plan for winter, why don't we actually be honest and get to the point? Why is there actually more than me? More than the gods we are creating ourselves to be? But, I murmured just enough to interrupt him, Log into anything, continued Tommy, not quite rage, but some semblant sibling of it rising, and see just how everything we are. You are still going to give me a non-more-than-me pseudo-metaphysical argument, I can tell. You're just telling me how to satiate my IQ and calling it a why. There is no sales pitch to maximize my life that doesn't just promise, at best, to turn it into gruel premium. Please, give me one that explains to me my gut as it churns with importance. Frankel says your eyes. Oh, that meaning in the meaning, except for the meaning outside of self, extinguishable for the finding of meaning. Maybe you throw Dostoevsky at me and explain how he was just like me and you and me and all of us struggling to see, and his answer brilliantly was a characterological analysis of piety versus iniquity made manifest. Another series of mammalian mirror learnings, base level complexities. And we'll have our laughs and cries, and I'll share my problems and we'll solve them amicably, and another human will have answered by action instead of answering by answering. Meaning, this new age stuff seems simply to be an IQ proportional monkey manipulation to ease us into I'm not sure what. You all espouse these so-called greats, but their answers amount not to an actual why. Not like it was, with a God telling me that I am co-creating my slice of meaning for something other than a means to an end of my not having a meaning. A dead end with floral notes and grandiloquent distractions. It has to be an existential ordering that makes it all for something, that in truth we are not just working for the perpetuality of man at best. I know you see, I know you see. Your brow all stuck and twisted into a shadow frown. I know you feel the wet spaghetti beneath your bridges. And stop yourself, please, before telling me that I can't fight the feeling of everything in me, for I wish to know what is driving the feeling, not that I have it, that the driver is realer than my wanting it to be. A cat is no more or less special because he is driven to a heated cat's end. And don't come with Nietzsche either, for he is obviously a solution of suicide from inept. Little shit, using his fraction of something moreness to counter something more than his. Don't tell me why it's good. Tell me why good is good. Why we are all actually meaningful. Why not just blow my head into the starry night of your ceiling here? There is not some sales pitch you can shoot at me, for like the rest of us disordered men and women, with our BPD, NPD, AVPD, and all that good, we have lived in the light of just what animals we are, stuck separate and thought stupidly alone. We need the truth that we are more than individuals, for our lives and the proxy truths of love or more than self-service were missed and continue to be missed by us. Disorders. Ha! All these labels you have swirling and spiraling above head mine. They aren't disorders, any more than they are cluster understandings for you to use to help me to dull the truth in every moment, in our every moments, and try and have us prove to ourselves that there is more. No, just no, I need more than me. My people, us, our people, this post-religious period. Oh, please let it be rather a gap period between becomings of God. We must... This flower is burnt, whisper grievous dropped Tommy. And maybe we solve my AVPD and kumbaya we sing. I know my own problems cause me to use this world's evil as camouflage for hating my own life, my searing reflection of refusal to do what must be done, my fear. But now I have opened this hole, and I... No. That's not what we're doing here. Just getting over my sniveling little problems and trauma that got me here. No, we're going to solve the gap for all of us. Try. We have to try. And also, don't tell me that Camus' character, with correct motivational understanding or metaphysically enforced sociopathic boundaries, with a better upbringing, couldn't act in a novel with as much piety as that holy one in The Brothers Karamazov, or Karamazov, or whatever. You know. Wrath after death is as shallow a motivation as a scary brother-in-law stopping me from beating my wife. That doesn't make me good, it makes me scared. Don't be afraid, says much many full times as morsels days in a year that famous B book. Motivation is called bad if it is for the self, except when I'm trying to get off to heaven. Come on now. Nietzsche, that flower that looked best at a tree but called it a plant. He's riding on bark but is so vehemently a flower that he thinks it a piece of stem. Such a partial work. The solution to my problem abstracted might allow us to solve the missing translation of this time. I guess screw you if you think I'm gloating solely for said purpose, but if one is smart, then talk is boring, proportionally so, because one with the ability to abstract out has little interest in intermediary talking, obfuscating, or tunneling for rabbits, those damn vermin. Vermin. What an ass I'm stomping as. But you get my point. You wouldn't talk addition to bore, so don't talk disorders to me. So, what are we getting at? If a person doesn't see in their childhood what all the works in the world attempt to translate, then monkey man he becomes just to try and survive and fill the void. What a limiting word, void. No, it's more like the feeling of emphasis on actual humanity, with clear eyes unfiltered by happenings. The feeling that we are so much more than separate beings of flesh and falsity, that we are one being, trapped as these people so alone, and simultaneously knowing by evil acts endured just how huge the human spaces between us are. So, I really need this pressure vessel, called me, to actually mean more than something makeable by me. We do, as our ancestors felt, fuller with less knowing. You know, you want to know what a disorder is? One of your classifications? It's the coping mechanism formed to survive this form without hope. That hope that we are more than just surviving as smart monkeys. They are the temperamentally adjusted attempts to maximize a life not worth living. So, I guess there is a little proof that we are more than multiple me's, that when living as any form of most ultimately monkey man unreally separate, it is simply a partial being that doesn't function in the society, said society as a mega proxy for humanity action and becoming as a whole. And, too, doesn't work to actualize worthiness outside of simulacrums, compulsive behavior addictions, or just raw addictions. Life of actual separation, as faux proven by abuse, only, and I mean only, insists that all we should embark upon are the dark tetrad chimpanzee plus actions, and that disorders to cope or make human life worth living, substances or people or manipulations or seclusions or rapes or murders or anything refined revenge at a time, are inevitably the only actions we have in truth that can at least let us forget this something in my throat right now that knows that it's all not fully true as I know it. How I am viewed separately is all I have, all that I am, as long as I am not actually more important than a me. Don't you understand that it's all I have if not God? Blood, sun, rising. Blood, sun collapsing. Noticing the inefficacious impact that the note had on Tommy's demeanor, I ambled on extemporaneously. Evolutionarily, I continued, our temporal existence, finite resources, and the biological functioning that is necessitated by them ensures that the biological system most inclined and motivated by the process of acquisition is the fittest. Thus, we have evolved to be more purpose-driven than stimulation-driven. Most of the time spent in our lives is between accomplishments. Revel in the journey. Don't stagnate in comparative attainment of stimuli. Tommy huffed and stared at me, rapidly remarking, "All of your explanatory science works if the mind you are explaining to is not wrestling with the subtle underpinning of being itself, as self. If you know that the edifice you are so enduringly constructing between stimuli is a means to an end, and that the transient joys are unable to satiate the bare minimum desires in most men, how can we call this life commensurate with a life worth living?" "We are not completely out of concordance," I responded. "We deviate solely in where we are attributing importance. You wish to seek something deeper than an arbitrary self-built structure. You claim only this will heal your soul. This salvation for deep meaning speaks more to your insecurity and lack of self-worth than to the universal emptiness that you've plainly observed." "I've already said that," he responded. In kind, I retorted, "You see, if you viewed yourself as inherently significant, say by accepting your inherent divinity, then your self-defined and ultimate meaning would become the paramount principle upon which you would build your life. It is not from the lack of depth within the objective landscape of life that your pain has bloomed, but rather from your place within the truthful arena of biology. Do as you wish to be." Silence lay over Tommy for a moment as he postulated his position internally. Nothing but haphazard quarter phrases were mumbled. "Isn't it true that—" he rambled. At a loss for words, he quickly pivoted. Before shifting topics, though, he said faintly, "Okay, for now I will concede and think." The next topic was the subjectivity of perception. He asked, "Is objective truth the collective subjective, or is it a universal constant?" "Does another sense exist if you cannot sense it?" I simply replied. "The ability, or lack thereof, to sense the environment attenuates full reality. For instance, infrared light is the only palpable truth for some snakes, but the full spectrum of wavelengths exists regardless. By extension, perhaps non-dimensionally or non-temporally constrained beings view us as we view a snake. This can be examined in a more pragmatic capacity by understanding that the universe may not be controlled by our perception of it. Rather, our interaction with the universe is funneled through our mammalian capacities to allow for a tangible piece of totality to unfold. The presumed unconscious energies that fill the rest of space and time and more are not restricted or superintended by such things, right? So, the universality of being is a priori true, even though the perception of the universe's consistency may be inconsistent. Hence, when referring to human knowledge, the best definition of objective truth may be the collective subjective. Hence, a more virtuous objective truth is defined against thoroughly agreed upon subjective truths. Empiricism becomes paramount here." "Well, what a lovely non-answer," he sharply retorted. "I suppose use obviousness instead of contrarianism, then, and answer it for yourself," I razor replied. I soon after wrapped up the session. When I returned to my lonesome obsessiveness, approximating scrupulosity, I questioned myself to reach the truth of our interaction. I wondered if I had answered Tommy's probes. I pondered which caveat I had missed. I couldn't believe the energy I was exerting in the pursuit of the boy's acceptance of truth. At that moment, I realized what truth had meant to him. He wanted no part of universality being funneled through him. He searched for the escape from his biological limitations. Smirking at my glorious victory, I thought to myself, "Ah, that's why he didn't like my subjective confinement." The next session was in no small way a success. Tommy began the session's conversation with an unfamiliar glow punctuating his proclamations. His demeanor, slightly stained with an aura of irreverence, seemed too facile. "Explain your glee to me," I demanded. Like some great orator, he handed me his haiku and recited it. Serendipity, serenity in morning. Of these things I know. I heard his poem and struck a pensive pose. He followed suit. The poem, simple yet extravagant, examined life so plainly, but with such intense accuracy. I thought to myself with disturbing lucidity, and then took a quick note. From early to late life, I noted, the poem explores the major moments. The serendipity of life as a willing youth leads to certain uncertainty that seems to always envelop and develop its pyrogenic progeny. The sanguine entropy of youth, so well encapsulated, gloriously gleams within the chambers of the first line. The homophones within the second line, morning, or morning, create a lovely and complex ponderance within the poem. The duality in meaning, when verbally presented, unyielding in pragmatic presentation, is stunning. Perhaps the haiku highlights the calmness within the crevice of morning, that time away from the travesties of life, a quiet and pensive time, the moment dedicated to the endogenous plights and quandaries of man. Maybe he calls before my mind the latter homophone. He must then be referring to the realness and abundant, undeniable purity of grief that only calls upon those who have loved and lost. His locution longed to describe this, perhaps. Both versions signal an important feature within the main stage of life. Simultaneously, the insecurity of the homophones emphasizes the eternally unpredictable nature of life. The lost line, so beautiful, reaches out and grips the final experience of life, a reflective and fulfilling time. It bellows out into my heart. Oh, the things I shall know. After Tommy's entrancing poetic spell had faded, I reorganized my thoughts into a singular question, asking, "How did you come to create such a lovely piece?" He smiled and thanked me. With little thought, he examined his processing and responded, saying, "I've spent my life quarreling with good and evil. I used each moment of my life to convince others of my value through virtue. We all spend life convincing ourselves and others who we are and what we believe. All this groveling is wasted on us anyway. We all know the inherent truths that fortify our wakeful delusions, deep within our bones. Perhaps this is why stillness frightens us. We are simply too well acquainted with ourselves, and realize it in those moments. A longing for morality has been so stained now, with emptiness as its sole follower, that it can never be satiated. I cannot live in the shadow of my life nor our truth any more. I wish to be one with the world, brimming with potential, neither good nor bad. Tommy abruptly raised his voice, completely impassioned. "I wish to smell a rose and deem it a flower. I lust for a love to engross me, and for me to label it a passion. I wait for my time to act and call it action. With the simplicity of thought gifted to those at peace, I want only to understand and accept the world as it is. This poem encapsulates my search. It calls forth the simplicity of our journey through life, from the deepest and realest part of us. Little remains of the poetic pollution usually imbued within the greatest pieces of art. Only the truth remains, the skeletal simplicity of life. It's all there." I thanked him for his answer, and inherently understood it without further questioning. We sat in mutual agreement of the poem's power. He was an incredible poet. Of that I was certain. Within that moment of quiet wonder, I caught him acknowledging me being very impressed with him. It was too obvious to verbally hide my pride in knowing the young man, and so we remained silent for some time while I navigated the best path forward for his mental well-being. I knew that in admitting to the poem's brilliance, I would only serve to bolster the young man's already inflated perception of his merits and thus denigrate his striving for a better future. So, I remained positioned to aid in my client's growth. I applauded his attempt and asked him to explain the personal significance of the poem. "It describes my life," he said, "well lived and dynamic, though troubling in simplicity." Unbelievably, the boy had felt he had lived a full life, 1/5 the way through his journey, and Tommy was done. He had been through the unjustifiable unsteadiness, the calmness, the love, and the loss. He knew of it all. Perhaps he felt as though it was his time for obliteration back into the unconsciousness of oblivion, to join his father in the settled security of some distant and unfeeling nebula. He felt beaten, yet accomplished, a trademark of maturity. His youthful appearance and energy, opposed by his tormented spirit, troubled me deeply. The rest of the session was spent debating on the necessity of being, while I formulated a counterclaim to the presumed postulate he had unearthed. Finally, we landed on a significant substructural component to reinvigorate his life. Tommy discussed his uniquely realized existentialism as being the most real and vibrant part of his life's meaning. It gave him joy to know that he was the beneficiary of a self-defined structure, and that the losses and realities that struck him with such austerity held meaning. The magnetism of man towards power, to truth, and into morality are all roused by hardships, explained Tommy. Only through the tormenting of a man may he discover what truly lies beneath. It is from the most fathomless depths of suffering that I have climbed to the most unfathomable heights of self-realization. The value of structure and a well-built life lies within the knowledge of its opposition. The understanding of the most severe disorder and chaos in a life not lived in a manner befitting a man of value is the very thing that necessitates movement towards goals and acquisition of those goals. This is where Scripture becomes valuable. Through ritualistically reinforced lessons and stories, the hardship of evil and the virtue of its antithesis are displayed and examined, allowing followers to embody the prevailing truth. Sacred text is vicarious wisdom. That understanding was a troubling delight to hear coming from Tommy. While it gave me hope for his future, in that he understood the basic principles outlined by the philosophical thinkers that developed the framework to which he admitted himself, it baffled me as to why he was still such an unsteady and nihilistic individual. He understood humanity at a level most petrifying to unveil, but he found no virtue in truth whilst claiming it to be the pinnacle of greatness. He needed more guidance, but the movement forward seemed more treacherous than ever. I knew that, for every incorrect theory or structure, a large computational system such as that intellectual whippet's mind needed not to fret with initial inaccuracies. Even from false premises, his systematically grand mind was to anyway fortify the faulty initial structures with immense rationalizations and dynamic justifications. The magnificent mind of Tommy could have been already too easily been misled into many theories that expelled inaccuracy. The powerful dissemination of those mixture groupings, his bag of productive and cancerous ideas, called upon all of his intellectual prowess, and thus the theories were, with great resolution, growing and morphing before my eyes and breath into a working moral composition. Though as inaccurate as any others, said thoughtful composition was being effectively used and tested, powerfully and compellingly, through colorful ideations and seemingly intrinsic extrapolations of discourse-like explosions. The initial constructs faded into the background, and new perceptual frameworks dominated him over and over again. His brilliant mind increasingly called for ultra-careful counsel. I buzzed with anticipation, ready to release him from his unthoughtful descent into moral subjectivity. Even while Kierkegaard and Marcel starkly opposed rigid religiosity, they dignified themselves with at least a moral possibility, allowing for some semblance of order without the confinement of a defined morality. I thought it interesting that Tommy hadn't done the same. When I asked about his potential misalignment, he took a moment for some internal dialogue. It is from the efficacious reality of existentialism that I draw my critique, he said calmly. The simplicity of the goal-driven framework leads back to simple mammalian biology. The deep enrichment of our lives that is perpetually driven by the next dopaminergic exercise calls me immediately to the thought of a mouse pulling a lever. This connection to such a simple creature insults my humanity. The philosophers, with all their honor of formulating this initial moral form, had no way of understanding the complexities of neuroscience. If they had, I am sure they would have also felt as though the theory's practicality is opposed to divinity because of its simple endocrinological manipulation. Newer age additions and addendums help, but I cannot help but to feel that we are jamming tacks into a space balloon. Tommy's thought seemed to be such a juvenile formulation. All those painstakingly combed through theorizations about the intricate depths of truth and understanding seemed more than ever to be nothing more than flagrant pontifications to ensure that I knew he was a capable adversary. And this seeming was especially not true. The clear lack of self-value within Tommy screamed at me. He had to be more than just biology. However, simultaneously, it all had to be worth more than just him to endure his life. With those thoughts floating through my mind, I continued plainly, adding, "Existentialism cannot satiate your thirst for transcendence from your biology. Divinity is the only route to elevation. Regardless, I must ask this of you. Is it that you must surpass biology to derive meaningful structure and joy, or is it rather that there are major biological parts of your life that are not being fulfilled? Busying yourself with thought will not solve your needs. Once fulfilled, these biological truths will bear positive fruits, and it will become clear that there is only purpose in everything." From that truthful condemnation, he distanced himself. He knew that any immediacy of creative counter-acknowledgement would call for a direct admission of lower status in the game he was so brutishly playing. And so, with predictably little haste, Tommy contemplated my absurdly destructive opposition. The busyness displayed so purposefully upon his face drove me to pull back a ridiculous grin, one that he had earned rather than me, with all my insecurity aroused. I realized that for one to relish any act of victorious conquest, the opponent had to be of a stature approximating that of the ephemeral conqueror. Hence, the intellect of Tommy had clearly enamored me enough to earn my regards to equitably view him as an opponent. That equity was a rather large feat for such a young man. It was so impressive, in fact, that it filled me with a sense of urgent dismay. The comparison between him and I, in timely study, involuted experience, and in-depth discourse was clear. However, the conversational therapy that his treatment had become had the tempo and characteristics of a conversation between a pair of peers in even dialogue. After some time to think, he stood up and looked upon me as if I were his subject. He patiently prepared his rebuttal. Though it is true that the depth of meaning could come from the self if well identified and easily distracted, he stated superciliously as he paced back and forth in his small little area of my office, we must remember that any person's life, no matter how well ordered or simple, is filled with the inexpediency of suffering. Whether deep or shallow, the suffering is constant and unrelenting. It is never an abstruse task to recall the suffering that anchors one to reality. This endured suffering must be fecundated through any moral lens to give it righteous purposefulness. Otherwise, the suffering, and more crucially, the person whose experience from which the suffering blossoms, is deemed pointless. It is with emphatic expedience that we must find the reason for the suffering, as this is much more abundant than the calmness between calamities. Growing ill-mannered from Tommy's robust contrarianism, I identified the thematic essence of his claims and began decompartmentalizing his bountiful assertions. From that seemingly ethereal set of suppositions, the truth seemed to peer through me too clearly. Tired of allowing him to talk circles around his real problems, and synchronously growing weary of his challenging spirit and tenacity, I hastened to quell him with a lengthy pronouncement. "You spend so much of your precious time delegitimizing the chasing of mammalian sensation," I said vibrantly, "not because it is unimportant or insignificant in building any certain grandeur within your life. Rather, perhaps it is because the realization that these pivotal instincts, desires, and emotions are essential, and that you have mostly failed in satiating them, would crush you into an even smaller man. Furthermore, rather than trying to confront the sources of anger and frustration that are dredging their way through your life, you attempt to posture yourself amongst intellectuals and derive meaning from this fruitless act. It is this process that has led you so sheepishly to where you are today." We sat for another long while after that exchange. And then, in an abrupt change of pace, he rejoicingly lunged into a new era of strength for him, musical theory. Tommy had developed a new piece of sitar music. He continued in line with his earlier musical appreciation by showing me a rather short recording of the song's chorus. The intricate plucking was only eclipsed by the rich, story-like note progression. He told me that he had only started playing the sitar a couple of months prior to the recording of such a transcendently lovely song. Once again, overly impressed, I clumsily responded with some appropriate gratifications. To express my actual concern, envy, or wonder would have been impossible. A truly grand life force shared the room with me. The piece was so earthly and instinctual. Ingrained in the simple melody was the deeply honest and almost personified by sound profusion of sadness that coded Tommy as an entrance into humanity. The skillful resemblance to life that piece contained within its musical matrix was on par with some of the greatest symphonies. I wondered how the young man could have been so talented, so plainly above average in all pursuits, but simultaneously deflated and insecure. To that end, I silently recalled an ingeminated quotation that had been first instilled within me by my father at his insightful end. I did not share it with Tommy, but somehow he knew and recapitulated the truth of my father's message. "It is of only the most extravagantly organized minds," Tommy's faint voice whispered, "to allow asinine fixations to become dilemmas of interminability. Trivial losses become losses of allegoric proportion. Unidimensional realities become the most entangled fixtures of contorted moralities. Love, happiness, and transcendence in the moment, instantaneous glory within the infinite now, are barely considered germane to the instant itself. This describes the best of men." His face suddenly glowed with irreverent frustration, growing uncontainable. "It is those men who push into the unknown and shine light on the undiscovered. It has to be. It just has to be." That was Tommy. His inescapable mind sub-true totally weaving a net that entrapped even the strongest spirits of his joy. The darkness within him had morphed him into some unholy vagabond. A cannibalistic conquistador had been born from the inferno of Tommy's broken heart and mind. It was the saddest thing I had ever seen. The next session brought about a conversation that plunged further into religious philosophy. Tommy was rather disturbed by the facts of universalizing religions, transposed by generational echoing. Predictably, he primarily focused on the multi-tool Christian doctrine. He proclaimed, "It is not the religions themselves that are to blame for the irreverence of the non-holy personage during their time on or in the physical plane. It is the presupposition that the transcendence of man comes before and after his physical life. This axiom of undeniability is ingrained into all, including the most atheistic of people. The eternality of the spirit, life force, energy, or whatever name is placed upon the unknown is the pivotal focus of the religious community. It is this intense focus on eternality that leaves most people aloof in the momentary happiness of a physical existence. But it is too stupidly true that divinity espoused and tied to eternality, manifested as individual sovereignty, is paramount in staving off tyranny and moral ambiguity. Some of the most secular of groups, the Bolsheviks for example, had no intention of valuing human life as the embodiment of the transcendent. That spirit had been eradicated with the abolishment of religiosity. Thus, the unrelenting atrocities of the East were of no importance, just a means to an end. So clear it is to see that the initial axiom was not vanquished, but rather emboldened by the brazen dismissal of human life, instantiated once said axiom had been disregarded. The arrogance of the Church paid back in full, I suppose. Yes, that's exactly it. Without an afterlife, life itself is meaningless. This religious statement was reinforced. Don't you see? Tommy's commentary imprecisely confronted but built much of his previous claiming, so my spine stiffened as I prepared to probe for clarification. "Why are you so troubled by the weight placed on the eternal?" I asked. "Is it because the idea of transcendental vivification gives you elevation from your mammalian desires, your sufferings, and your routines? Would acceptance of transcendence clear you of the nihilism that plagues you so viscerally? Could your lack of connectivity to religion be grown from your espousal of history? Are the atrocities committed in the name of the Church what sever your path to enlightenment? Too many questions, right? The disconnection between God, or Christian spirituality here, and the actions of the Church must be enacted to allow for the clarity of philosophical reasoning to remain unsoiled." "It is that logically fallacious idea," he responded, just post-cusp not interrupting me, entrancing as it may be, "that I hate most hearing. So often this idea is thrown around and used or unused at the best and worst times." I recoiled. He clearly had atheistic affinities outside of historical immorality. The rejection of religion, or any spirituality, indicated not the conclusion of a person who had conducted a deep and thorough investigation into the unanswerable. Rather, his end rationale seemed to be derived from the wounded heart of his injured and insolent infant. He was too disillusioned to accept that God, or some cosmic power, could have a hand in such a maleficent world he judged it to be. Or so I ignored him to believe. I laid into him. "This arrogant and self-righteous claim calls upon nothing more than ignorance of the self-serving human value system," I shouted, realizing my overexcitement. I quelled my voice and continued, saying, "One must know negative before positive. The light is only bright when it is in the antithesis of darkness. You explored this earlier in your analysis of vicarious wisdom, remember? Because the world has iterated peril doesn't mean that existence itself is this way, or that some ultimate force has arbitrarily made it to be this way. What if I could set the baseline of existence as searing pain held within each person's belly? Hunger would become a comfort, right?" His boredom shone through his muted tongue as he simply said, "We cannot honestly delineate history and religion. It either works or doesn't work for a time and place to transcend time and space motivationally." "The conflicts," I retorted, fear-mongering, and general group thinking that is all so criticized when played out by religious leaders and followers is so easily explained through the lens of evolutionary biology, distinct from the doctrine they miss. The illusion of impartiality of the scientific community is one of the main areas of concern regarding intellectualism. If we evolved from a primal hominid, and this hominid evolved from an ape-like species, then tribalism and aggression seem to be obvious and acceptable patterns that arise from our vestigial neurobiology. Transgressions and ailments shift into the expected realities of humanity. Additionally, if it can be assumed that the most atheistic man was the most spiritual before conversion, usually due to some ruinous force, then a priori the degree of anti-spiritual thought is proportional to the level of anger to which the atheist clings in response to the defacement of what he considered holy. Thus, the critique of religiosity is analogous to outward frustration with a general impoverishment of the mind, soul, or spirit, originally translated by religious thought that he disgraces and disrespects. This connectivity between evil and anger must be linked by a preeminent belief in divine benevolence, indistinguishable from God. With a sharp disdain for my disagreement, Tommy remarked, "It is the love that I have lost that drives me to identifying with the indifference of the universe." In response, I silently looked for a paper on which I had written a previous theory of mine, a chronicling of sorts. Once my work was found, I clearly and calmly read aloud to Tommy, saying, "There is stark congruency in the events and chronology of loss of faith for the lost faith atheists. The three-step process is iterated out across most self-proclaimed atheists' turning points. The loss of faith usually embarks on the same expedition. First, an unbelievably perverse or abominable action or event rises from the depths of unimaginable suffering and grips a devout somebody. In response, the subject becomes angered and disillusioned with the goodness of the god or gods that the person had vehemently espoused before the grievous action covered their reality with sadness. Lastly comes a rejection of the god with the affixed rationale of always something like, a god of infinite love logically should not let anything but love exist. Ah, did you catch the judgment there? Hold on to that. The unique entitlement of the misguided fruiting of faithlessness from this so-called atheistic process is unmatched. The first two steps, if the religiosity was not present, would never have occurred. The unfeeling nature of the universe allows for no anger or disillusionment. The blind fury and blame placement could never have existed without the faith in something more than themselves upon which they could have originally laid the blame. Hence, losing faith is an internally destructive process, self-referentially impossible from its inception. Without step 1 or 2 complete, the program can never truly be completed genuinely. There is consistent argumentation against the God they try to reject. It is a cover for their anger against God. The masquerade of anti-religious rhetoric is driven by anger against God's plan, seemingly cruel and unusual. The infatuated upkeep of atheism signifies the consistency of the faith. It is with great passion that these atheists run from God, or perhaps attack him belligerently, never actually losing their faith in the process. So, given the absoluteness of these feelings, the unavoidability of judgment, and the impossibility of believing or non-believing, surely it is best to embody the sacred, or, in your own words, enact the vicarious wisdom. Paralyzed from thoughtfulness, Tommy shuffled through his brain. He sat still whilst his eyes wandered, remaining closed. Like a cat and mouse in their eternal game of pursuit, Tommy's eyes rolled around under their lids. After a while, once his eyes had become almost spiteful in their closure, he asked, What of the program for atheists with no religiosity to begin with? I quickly retorted, "This theory pertains to the lost faith atheists like you. Instead of evading the invasiveness of the disagreement within yourself, take this on and perhaps you can revivify your faith. It has been dormant, waiting for you." "How do you know I'm a lost faith atheist?" he uttered. I looked at him and we chuckled together. It took some time, but Tommy finally realized the merit of accepting and moving past his unspoken trauma. He tried no other rebuke of my theorem. Newly, I could tell that there was a stillness in his movement, his actions lagging after the unsettling correctness of his thoughts. That was the way with Tommy. He understood the pitfalls and the problems, with a clear explanation affixed to each. However, he could never drag himself to the peaceful paradise of change. Like a walrus bathing in some stagnant sunlight, very few techniques could be exploited to roll the tonnage over, even if that stillness meant certain death by overheating. He often reveled in the ultimate futility of modern life, and furthermore dwelled in the pit that was the inescapability of it, mega restated by what he claimed to be the best of him. During one such rendition of his reductive musing, he said, "We are, as we have always been, necessitated action machines. Thought is much easier on the body than true action. Hence, if action is not necessitated, we stagnate. Life has become easy enough now that we can live through an array of proxy experiences. If we need connection, we read or listen to an intellectual. If we are filled with lust, we ingratiate ourselves with voyeuristic pursuits. If we crave destruction, we engage with portrayals of violence." He smiled contemptuously, reality biting him hard. "After all," he continued, "on a beautifully frigid winter's morning, would you rather endure the cold and chop wood, or light up your gas fireplace and fall into amusing repulsion at the frightful scene outside? We have arrived here, in the 21st century, as always intended. It must pass into the hands of chaos. In time, that chaos will once again restore the danger, compelling us to rebuild the structure. Perpetuality reinstated. In this we may find fulfillment once more. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it has all been another fine, fiery step towards perfection." Blood, sun, imploding. I felt that I needed to offer him my admiration by exploring his assertion. "Yes, well, if you do and then think, perhaps you will find that this very strength is necessitated intrinsically, aroused by faith-based movement forward. This is why you cannot find strength or action. It lies within your misapprehension of the dynamic nature of motivation's origination point. From where you find yourself, you may find your purpose. First, you must arrive at the conclusion that you are worthy of direction. Before all this, though, you must act as if prosperity is possible and embody the spirit of action. This is why your lack of faith is killing you, or why whatever is killing you is providing your lack of faith." Aroused, he continued his speech against the world, almost shouting. His proclamation was spoken into direct reality. "God has been dead for a long time, and I cannot, rather, no one ought to try to, see themselves as intrinsically important. I am no anti-Christ. I am just me, an animal with a call for power. This place has truly done it. I am done." I installed a visible sense of keen observation in my stare and watched as he remained unmoved. I wanted to understand the depth of his sentiment. I knew that my glaring objection, funneled through my gaze, was to thoroughly inspect his commitment and adherence to such a terminal tirade. If he quivered or begged for a chance at recapitulation, I knew that his revulsion had been a shallow breech outburst. He remained steadfast and stared back in anguish-filled anger. It was as if Tommy, mirror staring me down, was actually standing in front of some door between oblivion and harmony. Tommy carelessly spun that door's key around his finger, the fragile twine stripping away with each turn, seemingly leaving me to be just a witness. Hoping for some blossoming of objective realization and movement towards growth, I shifted the subject to analyze a functional metaphor on which I had been working, breaking our stare. The metaphor was simple. It was a representation of consciousness as an inanimate viewing port. Glasses, perhaps. I swiftly said, "The truth of the objective reality is the light, unmuddied and opulently bright, but too intense and uncontrolled for anyone to take the full force of it directly. This objective light allows for no misinterpretations or malformations. Raw and totally true it is. Here we may introduce a set of perspective glasses, and this is what makes them up. A person's sensitivity is the translucency. This clear or tinted lens is the least potent portion of the structure, defined by the mundane presets of endocrinology and neurobiology within each person. The lens's structure, manifested as refraction, is where personal identity and nuance becomes apparent. This characteristic controls how the light is distorted and fits into a framework of functionality. This fit is the emotional or moral interpretation of the objective truth. Furthermore, the funneling process allows for transformation of present experience into hierarchical and rational understandings of things and events. We may call this consciousness, or identity perhaps. The most important and often malformed partition of these metaphoric glasses is their distortion. Representative of the prefrontal cortex's capabilities, this constitution either yields unbelievably productive or equally destructive perceptions of truth. I took the next moment to let Tommy gather all the complexity, and watched his already caught-up face impatiently beg for more. All these systems, I quickly continued, allow us to derive consistency from entropy. This is why trauma is so damaging. Trauma takes the glasses and shatters them. With your structured perception of the world laying beneath the boots of inevitable evil, the light becomes blinding and the unknown grips you. My job is in the restructuring of the refractive capacity of your lens. Tommy was rather rapidly released from his fascination with the metaphor, even with all of his unsettled traumas, cascading sets of microfractures, and renewal calls for updated psychological eyewear so present between us in growing truth. He argued for some small time, extending and modifying the metaphor to fit his neural network. I allowed it hesitantly as all my facial grace creaked and my envious bile bubbled. Our time eventually dried up once again, and he was off, his mind racing with dynamism, applied so callously well. I knew that my analytic tool had helped Tommy to simplify the basic concepts of therapeutic aid into a memorable physical object, allowing for his pragmatic emboldening against the demons that awaited his isolation. And so I forced a smile for a while after he had left, attempting to convince myself that I was indeed not awfully falsely happy. Predictably, 5 minutes after leaving, Tommy charged back into my office. This next mini-session was marked by disagreement. Before, Tommy had wandered out of my office, with his eyes darting around, fluttering with possibility. Now, though, his eyes were fury red. "If objectivity is such a prosperous light," Tommy yelled, embroiled in something more than us, "then why has it cursed me into isolation? It caused the removal of friendships, viewing them through a physiological framework. I have focused on only one thing, comparatively undercutting someone else's or raising my own stature in all the competence hierarchies. How could this be a good thing? This clarity of mind and objective lens, limited in tint and refraction, has caused me such fine misery in desolation. Alone? But at least I know why? Is that what you want?" With my temper hot and frustration clear, I yelled back, hastily clarifying, "Firstly, I don't want anything from you per se. I wish to help you in mending your own problems by empowering you to solve them earnestly. If what I have said has made you view your past with clarity, then all the better for you, right? The metaphor is a tool. Use it correctly. You have crafted a faulty set of specs. I will not have you lie to me and say that the erasure of kinship you underwent was a practice in objectivity. Everything you have done has been through a maliciously pernicious refractive index. All objectivity lost in the translation. I cannot believe you have the gall to barge back into my place of work and, with no grace or foresight, claim objectively caused isolation. Use your head. Your objectivity is misguided, and therefore is no objectivity at all. You disregarded those friends because you didn't fit into the megalomaniacal structure that you pre-constructed in a manner befitting your inflated self-importance. You ran from them, Tommy. It is not the landscape that troubles you, but rather the lack of ability to march within its borders. You have cost yourself from your own graces. After I had finished my defense, Tommy stormed out with most of his angst remaining. Like a child confined to a crib, he was trapped within the truth. He wasn't aggravated with me, but rather with the fact that he had shared too much with me. It was becoming clearer to him that there was no longer an avenue for escape through the manipulation of truth. I had gotten to know Tommy from the ground up, so he could no longer hide from me. Inescapable growth was coming. I anxiously awaited the productivity that lay ahead of us. 6 or 7 minutes later, after making sure of Tommy's leaving's actuality, I packed and locked up. Statically charged and stuck atop my doors just above floor trim was a page of something. With a huff and a firmly planted set of glasses on my nose, my inspection of the busyness came and went and uncovered the following notes. New word. Existential. Tommy's definition. An adjective that moves past the noun being described and adds more things, expands to reality itself and perfect alignment, devastating moments, etc., etc., etc. Notes to self. Why is definition of meaning from A to B, not B to B or B to A? Draw a rat-like creature and a beautiful star unknowingly sketched on either sides of a canvas, and then through the two run half parabolas with positive concavities and vertexes as either sketch. Have them converge at a point of interception labeled meaning, a vector arising from said point of direction, we'll see. All this complexity and logic fails to justify or translate the truth that we are more than selves eating away at time. The why to creating the why remains to be said, and found, and translated. Complex simplicity piled upon a toothpick crumbles as quickly as grained silica. Moreness needs not a refusal or blind admittance, but rather perhaps a translational update. The incorrectness of even these sentiments seems to be how much of me is within them. Why? One cannot hate nothingness, i.e. no God, and be able to spite it with evil or atheism simultaneously whilst upholding the truth. A reason not to believe can never be judgment, for judgment requires the known and felt existence of two extremes, simplified as good and evil. This has been Chapter 4 of In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.